It's Sherry at Savvy Business Resolutions with the first episode of the Investing in Conversation podcast. I'm leading with a conversation about the skill set which, as you'll hear, has been described as the most important for any manager. It's definitely the most important skill if you've got to resolve disputes or manage conflicts at work. To help me unpack the topic, I've been talking to Julian Treasure, an internationally renowned expert on the subject of our relationship with sound and a passionate advocate for listening. But I started by asking him to outline the relationship between noise and conflict.
Well, noise is potentially very damaging to all human beings, depending on the level of noise and the type of noise, of course. Because hearing is our primary warning sense, that means that sound goes very deep, very fast. You respond to sound 20 times faster than you respond to visual input. And that means that your lowest and oldest part of your brain is processing noise around you at a subconscious level very, very quickly. And it has a hotline to your hormones and your whole physiology. So, for example, if there's a sudden noise, if a car backfires behind you, you will immediately go into fight-flight mode before your cortex has an opportunity to go, oh, no, that was a car backfiring, I'm safe. But long before that, your amygdala and, the lower parts of your brain, the older parts of your brain have gone, warning, and they're dosing you with cortisol, noradrenaline, your heart rate will increase. All of that happens in an instant. So certainly sudden sounds have that kind of physiological effect on us. Sound also changes our emotions, of course. There'll be sounds that we love, that make us happy. I mean, think of music, of course. Or there'll be sounds that we dislike that make us unhappy. So, there's a whole range of emotional responses to sound as well, depending on what's going on around you, a lot of which are below our level of consciousness. Sound also, of course, affects our cognition. We can't think so clearly when people are talking around us because we're programmed to decode language. We have no earlids. And that means that if you're trying to think and there's somebody talking, they're taking up a big part of your auditory bandwidth and make you potentially just a third as productive in those kind of noisy situations. And finally, sound changes our behavior. Now, this has been researched. We know, for example, that noisy offices make people less helpful. They've done that by creating scenarios where somebody drops papers or whatever and measuring how often people help in different auditory situations. We also know, because these hormones that I'm talking about, which aren't generated only by sudden noises, they're generated also by background noise that's unpleasant. And we know also through lots of endocrine galvanic skin response tests and so forth, we know that noise creates stress and fatigue. Now, if you have somebody who's stressed and tired, they are going to be much more likely to go into anger than somebody who's calm and feeling fresh and has a lot more resources, perhaps.
Absolutely. So
little things in noisy situations can trigger rouse, conflict, anger, even violence. And it is certainly true, if you think about it, that very often violence in particular is accompanied by a lot of noise. War is not a quiet thing, and nor are, riots.
No.
Noise can also stimulate, of course, conflict. So in all sorts of ways, noise makes us more likely to move into anger and confrontation. And it also tends to be around and to escalate those things. So definitely we need to be very conscious of this relationship between noise and conflict.
Of course, you don't need a riot in the office for noise to create the kind of stress that creates disputes and conflicts, do you?
Absolutely. It's often a simple thing that's just builds up being irritating, like a banging door. You can habituate to a constant sound, although it will create, in the long term, stress and fatigue, but it's a more gentle long-term effect. It's the old frog in a pan of water type effect. Imagine sitting in an office where there's a door that hasn't got an effective closure on it. It bangs every time it comes through it, which is, every few minutes. That's going to drive you berserk. We can habituate to stochastic sound, to randomly generated backdrops of sound. It's the difference between a dripping tap, which is very irritating, and gentle rainfall, which most people find very soothing and pleasing. So that the texture of the sound, the content of the sound is absolutely critical. And a lot of this, of course, will be personal.
This sort of stress doesn't just hit our psychological and social health, does it?
Certainly if you're in an office and the background noise level is over 60 decibels, that's not good for you. In fact, we know that the level at which background noise starts to increase your risk of heart attack is 65 decibels on average, which is the noise level in many classrooms. So teachers may well be shortening their lives by working in that situation. And certainly having to shout at the pupils creates almost an adversarial. Certainly there's an increase in stress levels for everybody if the background noise is causing the teacher to have to shout in order to be heard.
I've experienced something very similar in offices.
Definitely. And there's an irritation level that comes, even if you're in a meeting room and it's got poor acoustics with standing waves which make people's voices boom and it's just an unpleasant aesthetic, that will put people's hackles up and create a less productive meeting. So we're talking about levels and levels from, a beautiful soundscape which is going to foster calm and kind conversation to very noisy soundscapes which are going to make people very quickly stressed, fatigued, angry. There's a continuum there, and it is very important to start listening to what's going on around you and be conscious of the context. The basic model behind a lot of my work over the years has been the circular relationship between speaking and listening, because the way I speak affects the way you listen affects the way I speak. So that it's not a straight line, it's circular. And all of that happens inside of a context, which is what we're talking about here, the background noise, which can be devastating.
Because the context shapes the content of our communications. So it shapes the outcomes.
Which is certainly what you can do the moment you start consciously listening to the soundscape around you. That's why my main mission in life now is to generate listening in the world, because to me, conscious listening always creates understanding, and that is conflict resolution. If somebody's very upset, the easiest way to calm them down is to listen to them. I've got tools that we can talk about later on which help with that process, and I'm sure, with your training you've got many too, but listening defuses conflict and creates understanding if it's done consciously. We're not listening to judge, we're not listening to make wrong, we're listening to understand. Now, that is absolutely crucial, and I think never have we needed listening more than we do in the world right now. We're seeing polarization and demonization and caricaturing and hatred all over the place. There's so many things undermining our listening, which for hundreds of thousands of years was our primary way of communicating and connecting with other human beings and staying safe as well. If you're in a cave 100,000 years ago, you'd better be listening in the dark because there might be something else in there. Listening is how, ever since we invented language about 150,000 years ago, listening is how we've communicated, learned, built on previous knowledge and learnings, and, improved the way we get on with each other or not. Until, of course, writing was invented just 5,000 years ago. And since then, we've moved from being an oral culture to being an ocular culture very, very much in the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, which created a lot of noise, of course, which continues. And then also democratized reading, which had been the province of the elites until then, really. But now everybody reads, or that's the plan. And in fact, it's a scandal if a child leaves school unable to read or write. We don't teach children how to speak or how to listen. What is going on?
Part of the issue here is the confusion between the ability to hear and the skill set of listening, isn't it?
Yep, that's very fundamental to all of my work. There's a bit of a blind spot here. It's the old don't know what you don't know syndrome. Most people don't know that listening is a skill. So hearing is a capability, listening is a skill. and it's different. It's a mental act. It's work. And although 1 in 4 humans on this planet have got hearing damage now, largely noise-induced hearing loss through industrial situations where they've been working on building sites or in construction or in very noisy places for years and years and their hearing is damaged. I would include even teachers in that, although most of the problem with teachers has been voice loss. There's been cases of teachers suing authorities for losing their voice altogether because they're having to shout day after day. So, yeah, we do need to educate children about hearing and about listening. Just think, if we started by teaching children how to listen, how much more of their education would they receive?
But it's never too late, is it? Especially if you're in a leadership role.
Oh, definitely. I spoke to Hiram Smith for my last book, and the book was called How to Be Heard, which was a kind of Trojan horse title, and it came off the back of my TED Talk, How to Speak So That People Want to Listen, which has been seen by 5 times as many people as my TED Talk about listening. So when I wrote the book, How to Be Heard, I called it that, but actually there's quite a bit in that book about listening. And I spoke to Hiram Smith, who's died now, but he was the CEO of the Covey organization, the 7 Habits. And he said he thinks that listening is the most important skill for any manager. And gave me an example where, there was a guy on their binder line who had an idea. And fortunately, he had a manager who was a listening manager, and sat down with him and listened to his idea, and it was worth $3 million a year to them. Now, it would have been so easy to tell the guy, just get on with your job, don't get too big for your boots, and so forth, because listening becomes more difficult the higher you get in an organization, because you're supposed to know. You're supposed to be a great leader. And there's a kind of paradox here, because if you start asking people questions and listening, does it come across as weakness or lack of knowledge or lack of experience? Well, it shouldn't.
No.
I mean, there are examples of rather despotic leaders who are very, very good. Steve Jobs comes to mind. He was not somebody who listened a great deal, did a lot of shouting at people if you read about Steve Jobs. The saving grace was he was right most of the time. And, was just a genius at knowing what people really wanted and what was going to be successful. But, of course, there are also examples of despotic leaders, Putin comes to mind, who surround themselves with people who are going to agree with everything they say. They never have a challenging view put to them, and that would be rather dangerous. And as a result, they become entrenched, ossified in their thinking, and it becomes quite, dislocated from the real world, with terrible consequences for companies. We would think of, I don't know, all those examples. Kodak, for example. People are always going to need photography, yes, but not the way you used to do it. So I think it's very important to have, in any organization, diversity of opinion, a team of people who aren't all the same, who don't all think the same way. And permitting challenge in that team means listening to people with whom you wouldn't necessarily want to go down the pub or have a social chat with, but people who are different from you.
I was thinking about this just recently in the context of business partners. I mean, a successful leadership team needs people with different strengths and skills and all that kind of thing. Otherwise, the business just ends up with all the same weak areas, only multiplied.
Definitely.
But I've seen the flip side, where the differences at the top have polarised people and they've not been able to communicate, and the whole thing has ended up falling apart.
Definitely true. I teach a tool. It rests on the understanding, and this is something that most people don't understand. 2 people can have very, very different views and both be right, because they listen and they come from different backgrounds, they have different perspectives, different values, attitudes, beliefs. They have a whole different perspective on the world, and in their world, each of them is right. Now, we are in a society which is addicted to making people wrong, because if I make you wrong, that makes me right. And everybody has this incorrect assumption that it's a zero-sum game. It's not. You can be right, and I can be right, and we can differ enormously in our opinion about what would fix the situation or what we should do. So if you start from that base, that it's not about being right or wrong, it's about different flavors of right, then you can start to move to a very different way of resolving conflict. The tool I use, or I've created, is called PAVE. The P stands for paraphrase. So in the first place, you've said something and I will say, okay, I understand exactly what you've said, Sherry. Let me just get this straight. What you're saying is this. And I repeat back to you my understanding of what you said. Now, that's very important because I may not have received it correctly. I may have filters that, warp it or twist it. You may not have said it very well. Who knows? And so what I'm checking here is that the ball has come over the net, that I've actually received what you meant to send. Now, that takes out the first level of a lot of conflict, which is misunderstanding. So paraphrase is the first thing. So what I understood you to say is this. Is that right? Yes. Okay. Now we can move on to the second very important part, which is admit. Now here I'm talking about letting something in. Even if it's a view that you don't hold yourself, that you find difficult, upsetting even, let it in because it's true for that person. So when you admit that and you say, okay, I will allow that, I understand that's true for them, you're then in a position to do the V, which is the single biggest thing missing in this world today, in my opinion, and which is creating so much conflict, the lack of it, and that is validation. What does validation sound like? It sounds like, Sherry, I get that. I have to say I don't agree with you, but I do understand why you would think that. It makes sense, given what's happened to you, that you would feel that way. So I'm not invalidating you. And invalidation is always a conflict escalator. That's rubbish, Jerry. Invalidation is immediately going to create confrontation. It's going to polarize. It's going to put people in an adversarial position. Validation, on the other hand, Sherry, I see what you're talking about. I understand why you would think that. Okay, then I can empathize, which is the E of pave. So given that you feel that, you think that way, or that's what happened to you, you must have found that very upsetting. And I can actually empathize with you getting to an upset about something that I wouldn't find upsetting at all, for example, but you did. And I'm not making you wrong. Oh, don't be so silly. The thing that many people will do to children, for example, which is invalidation and, the opposite of empathizing. So pave, paraphrase, admit, validate, empathize. And it's a very powerful way of two people who perhaps, you mentioned maybe you've got a business partner who's very different from you. When you're into conscious listening, you're always conscious that you're listening to somebody with whom you don't have the same filter, and you can be using pave all the time to avoid falling into conflict.
That's a great summary of what happens in mediation, actually. You can start off with two people, sometimes more than two, but let's say two people in front of you who have come through the same experience, but they have diametrically opposed takes on it. And as a mediator, what you want to do is move them to a point where they see their totally opposite problems as a joint issue that they can collaborate to solve. The first step has to be trying to get each one to see the other person's situation from that other person's perspective. Sometimes they'll get to a point where they say, oh, yes, I can see what he's saying. But when you dig into it, you realise they're still only seeing the other side from their own perspective. So one person might be getting really upset and the other's sitting there going, well, I see his point, but I don't know what all the fuss is about.
Very much so. And this is about conscious listening to me. This is, it's an integral part of conscious listening, to understand that when you're listening to somebody else, you may not agree with them. There's always something to learn. I talk about seeing people as opportunities to learn. If you're listening with the 4 C's that I teach of effective listening, which are consciousness, it's the first C, conscious that you're doing something. I'm listening. I'm doing something. It's work. It's an act of will. It is something that I'm conscious of doing. And if I'm not conscious about it, then I'm probably not doing it in the right way. So this first C is conscious. The second C is committed. That is to say, I'm going to put things aside just here because this is an interesting or potentially difficult or dangerous conversation. So I'm going to put down the phone. It's not, partial listening is perfectly appropriate in many situations. You're doing the cooking, somebody comes in, tells you a joke, you can carry on cooking, that's fine. But if somebody comes in and they're angry or really upset and they're sharing something important, then it's put down the cooking or just say, I'm so sorry, let me just finish this and I'll come sit down and listen to you properly. So that being conscious of the way you're listening and asking, is this appropriate, is very, very important. So that's part of the consciousness, and then commitment to listening in the right way. The third C is compassion, seeking to understand the other person. That's a vector in your listening. It's a dynamic in listening. If you are seeking to invalidate people all the time, you want to be right and make people wrong. We've all met people who are very judgmental, dismissive, and won't take criticism and criticize everybody else. That's very difficult. These kind of people are not going to be great leaders. I've suffered in an organization where it was run by a sort of tyrant like that, who was so critical, so aggressive, that nobody wanted to give the person bad news ever. So they stopped giving them bad news and started making out good news, and the whole thing fell apart. So that's just not a great way to lead if you're that kind of making people wrong. Seeking to understand, compassion, that's a great vector to have. And the other great vector to have is curiosity. I may learn something here. Now, it may be that you'll learn how not to do things from somebody who's making massive mistakes or doing it all wrong, but listening attentively to learn, always being open to learn, not being, in that wonderful Zen story, not being the full teacup, which, the Zen master keeps pouring tea into, and he says, a full cup does not allow anything else into it. So, if you think you know everything, then you're not going to learn anything. Having the humility to know that there's a lot you don't know. There's always something to learn from almost every conversation. That's a great way to be. And listening, to me, is all about humility. It's difficult as you become a great leader, because you're supposed to be strong and, on top of everything. And the humility of listening to another person, giving them your full attention, admitting what they say into you and maybe learning something from it. You're then able to teach them something because you've listened to them and you see where their strengths and weaknesses are, another part of great leadership. But the humility of listening is a huge part of it.
In all sorts of situations where we want to influence people, it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking you can only do that if you're speaking.
Absolutely, in whatever field you're in. I mean, we talked about leadership and the importance of listening and leadership. I mean, how can you lead people if you don't know what their strengths and weaknesses are, what drives them, what motivates them, what pisses them off? You need to know all those things. I mean, some other areas where listening is so important, sales, for example, where the research is very interesting. I've just seen recent research showing that most salespeople, on average, salespeople spend too much time speaking and not enough time listening. The ideal close ratio is roughly 40% speaking and 60% listening. Most salespeople have it round the wrong way. And of course, when you think about it, listening is such a key element of influence and sales, because how can you sell to somebody if you don't know what their triggers are, what their fears are, where's the pain, what's the problem I can solve with my products? We've all had the irritation of somebody just getting onto the phone and banging on about stuff which is not relevant to us and is just annoying, especially if they're doing it in a high pressure way. So yes, listening in all sorts of situations. Parenting would be another one. The hideous old Victorian thing of children should be seen and not heard. Well, as you can imagine, I rather disagree with that one. Listening to children is, it's a really important thing to do in this world where we've got something in our hand the whole time that's calling for our attention. There are some huge organizations spending billions to get our attention the whole time, to capture it and take it away from our families. Totally. And the best way to teach a child to listen, of course, is to listen to the child, to lead by example. And that means going down to their level very often. Adults will talk to children who are maybe 2 or 3 feet high, standing and towering above them. Oh, it's so much more effective if you kneel down or sit down and put them on your knee and you're eye to eye with the child. Then they feel listened to. And it's a wonderful gift to give to a child, that kind of attention, because you're showing them you're important. Your views matter. And again, you won't agree with them necessarily. And I've told you 17 times you can't have an ice cream now. But I understand why you want one.
Yeah, but we all want to be heard and understood like that, don't we? It's a basic human need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I said, my TED Talk on speaking has been seen by 5 times as many people as my TED Talk on listening. So it's clear that people are far keener to be heard than they are to listen. And if you think about the maths of that, it doesn't work very well. If we're all shouting to be heard and nobody's listening, that's a dysfunctional society, which is unfortunately the way we're heading. I did a talk a few years ago at TEDx Athens, and the talk was called The Sound of Democracy. And I said, the sound of democracy is listening. Because without listening to other people and seeking to understand them, how can we have a community where, if there's more of you than me, I have to live by your rules and I have to accept it. Civil society depends on compassion and understanding and tolerance. And you look around at all of these things like cancellation culture, cancel culture. I don't agree with you, so you're not allowed to speak. That can't be right. I need to listen to you and understand why I disagree with you, why you think what you think. And maybe there's a coming together somewhere. There's a synthesis of our views, which will allow us to move forward. And maybe there's some right in what you're saying. Even if I completely disagree with you, I would defend to the hilt your right to say it, as long as it's not hate speech or, inciting violence to other people. There's a wonderful John Ronson TED Talk about social media shaming, which I urge everybody to watch. It's terrifying what can happen on the internet. Now, you've got to be so careful, haven't you? It's the lack of listening which is behind all of it, to me.
The good news is we can all do something to improve the situation, can't we?
Yes, absolutely. We can teach our children how to listen. We can become conscious that listening is a skill and work at it. My new book, it gives another reason to listen, as well as the ones we've talked about, the social reasons, the family reason, the work reasons to listen. It's because sound is wonderful. Sound is amazing.
So what's in the new book?
Well, the new book is called Sound Effects with an A, and it is about the relationship between humanity and sound. So it is fundamentally about our listening and how it's decayed. And it goes through several different classes of sound. It's a grand tour of some of the wonders of sound, as well as it's full of practical hints and tips about improving your own listening. So it looks at biophony. That's one chapter, which is the sound of living things on our planet. And there are many, many amazing examples of those, from snapping shrimps, which are, tiny little things which are making noise that's rock concert loud under the sea, to blue whales, of course, and they're thrilling and unbelievably, well, I find it mesmeric, the sound of blue whales. And of course, there are all of the sounds that you read in the book are on a website. You can listen to them as you're reading the book, which has been fun putting together. Then there's geophony, the sound of our planet, from rain and hail and thunder to volcanic eruptions, meteor strikes and so forth, tidal waves, earthquakes, all sorts of powerful but then also beautiful sounds. Also, there's the sounds of humanity. There's a whole chapter on anthropophony, our sound, which can be, it's beautiful, but it's also terrible. And we are so numerous now that we're having this enormous effect on the world through the sound we're making. And there's a chapter, surprisingly, on cosmophony. Most people think space is silent. Sound is out there all the time. Way too low in frequency for us to hear. Wavelengths of light years. So these are, 50 octaves below what we could hear. The sound of supernovae and so forth. Space is not a vacuum. It's a very dilute plasma. And that means that very long wavelengths have got perfectly good mean free path to make their way through it and create sound, even in galactic space. There's a lot of surprise in there, and the final chapter is about silence, and that very important sound. So it was 2 years' work. I'm very excited. It's coming out on the 27th of March in the UK and the 17th of June in the US. And it's had some wonderful comments from some great people who've really enjoyed it. Susan Cain, Stephen Bartlett, the guy who does the Diary of a CEO podcast, Chris Anderson, the head of TED. They've all said lovely things about the book. So, yes, I hope people enjoy it. And most of all, I hope it causes listening. I hope it's a pebble in the pond and that the ripples of the book spread listening outwards.
It strikes me this book lends itself to audio.
I have done an audiobook, which I recorded up here in Orkney. It's really lovely to do this. There's a little studio up the hill where normally it's full of barons and fiddles and things, because there's a lot of wonderful folk music up here in Orkney. And I recorded my last book there, which then went off and won the 2 global awards for Best Business Audiobook. So, yes, I went back up there to Stuart, and he's brilliant. He's so patient, and it's a very small studio, but we get a very nice sound. And certainly the people at Quercus, the publisher, are very happy with it. We've also been able to put sounds in there, so where licensing and legalities allow, I'll be saying, and then there's the sound of this, and you'll hear it as you listen to the audiobook. Views, for example, I've done quite a lot of interviews with very interesting people, from Professor of Cosmology Mark Whittle to world-famous producer Mark Ronson and so forth. And those interviews, you can listen to the people speaking as opposed to me reading their words, which I think makes it that much more interesting as well. In fact, off the back of the book, I'm launching an online community called the Listening Society for people who like or are interested in sound, and people who want to improve their listening or who want to improve the world's listening.
When's that happening?
The Listening Society opens its doors on May the 1st, so not long after the book is launched on March the 27th. We're populating it at the moment with all sorts of wonderful content, so I'm very excited about that as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me when you've got such a lot going on.
It's always a pleasure, Sherry.
If you need help with any aspect of conflict management at work, come and talk to me. All my details are on the website, savvybusinessresolutions.com.